Welcome to The Truth About Vaccines. I'm your host, Ty Bollinger. Now, you may recognize me from documentaries that I produced in the past on the subject of the truth about cancer. A natural progression was to investigate the truth about vaccines and bring awareness to that topic as well. And that's exactly what we've done. I truly believe that the next 7 days are going to change your life, and I look forward to going on this journey with you. So let's go ahead and get started. It's a commonly held belief that people, including doctors, are either pro-vaccine, in other words, they believe that all vaccines are safe and effective for all people all the time, or anti-vaccine, in other words, 100% against all vaccines all the time. But is this accurate? Are these the only two legitimate positions about vaccines?
It's absolutely ridiculous to even talk in terms of pro or anti-vaccine. The reason why is that it would be like talking in terms of pro or anti-antibiotic. So you can know that it's absolutely wonderful to have access to antibiotics when you need them, when they're being used appropriately, when there's a bacterial infection that an antibiotic can really help beat. That doesn't mean that you would prescribe an antibiotic for a viral infection. But somebody, a doctor or a parent who didn't want an antibiotic for a viral infection, you would never call that person anti-antibiotic, right? So when people are questioning vaccine safety or vaccine efficacy or vaccine necessity, that does not make them anti-vaccine. That makes them pro-science and pro-common sense and pro-public health. The truth is, we all care about the same thing. We care about having healthy children and a healthy population. Nobody is anti or pro-vaccine. We are all pro-kid and pro-health. And questioning certain aspects of our current CDC vaccine schedule is actually really important if we want to make sure that our kids are safe and healthy.
I agree with Dr. Margulis. We all care about the same thing. We all want to make sure that our kids are safe and healthy. That's it. I think we can all agree on that, right? This docuseries will be focused on the scientific integrity of vaccine studies, the safety and efficacy of about a dozen particular vaccines that are in the CDC's current schedule, and the vitally important topic of vaccine freedom of choice. I don't want my opinions to get in the way of scientific facts, nor do I want to influence anyone to do anything against their own conscience. My goal is to present the truth so that you, the viewing audience, can make an educated decision for you and your own family. What's the theory behind vaccines? I asked Dr. Paul Thomas, a board-certified pediatrician from Portland, Oregon, this very question. What is the theory behind vaccines? Why do they work? Or what's the theory behind why they work?
Well, before I get into that, I just want to mention what we've lost in this whole vaccine discussion is that what really keeps us healthy is a strong immune system, all right? Now, having said that, is it possible to use your immune system and promote some aspect of it so you develop immunity against something that might be causing harm? And I think the theory of vaccination goes way back to smallpox, cowpox, Jenner, and all those pioneers. And they were able at that time to take a little bit of something that was causing disease or that was similar to it and get it under the skin and get your body to mount an immune response so that in the future, when you got exposed to smallpox, let's say, your body was ready to go, right? So in a simplistic term, I think that's what we're trying to do with vaccines. We're trying to prime the immune system with the organism that's been killed or pieces of the organism that's enough for the body to recognize it, and you develop antibodies so that next time you're exposed, your immune system reacts quickly and you don't actually get sick. So you'll have a huge immune response. And to some extent, we've been successful, but where we've lost, we may have won a battle, but we've lost the war, in my opinion, is the collateral damage.
We will be looking at the collateral damage, to use Dr. Thomas' exact words, over the next week. Vaccinations are credited with the reduction and even elimination of several diseases, including whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B, smallpox, meningitis, and influenza. If a person develops a positive antibody response following a vaccination, then that vaccination is considered to be successful, and that person is believed to be immune to the disease. We will address this topic, antibodies, in the next episode.
I am a member of the Academy of Pediatrics. We're supposed to be, the Academy of Pediatrics, the organization that guards the health of children. And when it comes to vaccines, which is what we're going to be talking about, I feel like the Academy has not been as thorough as perhaps I would like them to be in investigating what's going on.
That really sums up the reason that we produced this docuseries. We need more investigation, we need more discussion, and we need more honest debate. But the two diametrically opposing positions of those who are pro-vaccine and those who are anti-vaccine have resulted in a climate where civil discussion rarely takes place, where there's much more name-calling and pejoratives. This has created a climate that is not conducive to true debate or discussion.
In today's climate, you have the get your kid vaccinated now. And then you have a growing climate of don't vaccinate your kid. Now, neither standpoint allows for owning a decision and understanding why you make that decision.
The moment you question the safety of vaccines, you are a quack. The moment you bring up any issue with safety, you could be pro-vaccine, but if you bring up one safety issue, you're automatically a quack. We have Nobel laureates who've brought this out, right? These are Nobel laureates, and suddenly they're being called quacks and idiots and crazies because they're questioning the safety of vaccines.
I think it's one of the most disturbing facts of our time that you can't even speak to the thing, the basic facts like vaccine inserts that state that all of these potential harms are possible and have been observed previously, and you can't even speak to them without being called an anti-vaxxer, whatever that's supposed to mean.
If we look back in history, we'll see people like the Italian astronomer and physicist Galileo. He was convicted in 1633 for publishing his evidence that supported the Copernican theory that the Earth actually revolves around the sun. Galileo was actually called a heretic for his anti-scientific, heliocentric, in other words, sun-centered, views, and he was sentenced to house arrest, where he remained for the rest of his life. Now, we later learned that Galileo's scientific theories were actually correct and that the orthodox scientific community of his day was dead wrong. Over the next 7 days, we're going to present expert testimony, scientific studies, and medical data in as concise and understandable manner as possible so that you can make wise decisions based upon informed choice. A big part of making wise medical decisions is the concept of informed consent.
The idea behind informed consent is that whenever you do a medical procedure, you have to talk to the patient about the benefits of the procedure, the possible complications with the procedure, and the other options that you may have. So with vaccinations, you have to talk about what are the positives of vaccinating your child, what are the potential negatives of vaccinating your child, and what are the alternatives. And one of the alternatives always has to be not vaccinating or spacing out the vaccines. And the problem is that doctors are incredibly busy. They're getting, they have less than 15 minutes in the office with a family. They hand them a piece of paper that comes from the CDC. That's not informed consent. That's not really saying to them, okay, look at this is really the pluses and minuses. And the problem is that most doctors in America haven't actually taken the time to do the fundamental research that they need to do to figure out what the true risks and benefits are of any given vaccine. So in this country, we don't really have informed consent when it comes to vaccines.
There's a term that I remember vividly being taught in medical school, and that's iatrogenic. So iatrogenic is caused by what we do. All right, if you take
what a doctor does.
Exactly. Okay. So if you take a medicine that I prescribe and it makes you ill or causes you harm, that's iatrogenic. All right, and I think we've lost our way in looking at vaccines and looking at what are the iatrogenic effects. In other words, what harm is being done by our vaccine program. So I wrote this book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan.
Because just so people know, you're not anti-vaccine.
Absolutely not. So the dilemma I was in 2008 after I had those 4 cases of children who regressed into severe autism, and I'd already learned about toxicity. I'd read studies on thimerosal, on aluminum toxicity. I mean, there's books on this topic. I could no longer ethically keep doing vaccines business as usual with the CDC schedule. And the things that concerned me the most were that hepatitis B dose for newborns. Back then they weren't pushing vaccines on pregnant women. That's happened since. And the sheer number of vaccines that were being given, for example, at the 2-month visit, we were giving 6 different vaccines, 3 of which had too much aluminum. So you're multiplying huge toxins, adding on top, and it was just clearly not a scientifically justifiable approach when you understand toxicity.
If you're going to give parents informed consent before they take these vaccines, don't just tell them that the vaccine was responsible for lowering the incidence of cases of measles. Tell them that there's studies that if you take this, showing that if you take this measles vaccine, you're statistically significantly more likely to be hospitalized after receiving that vaccine. Okay? You're more likely to have epileptic seizures. You're more likely to have allergies as a result of that vaccine. Okay? That's well documented. You're more likely to develop cancers and heart disease in later life if you've taken that vaccine, because it has suppressed you from being able to develop those protective effects that you gain when you are exposed to that disease naturally as a child. So if you want informed consent, you have to have all of that information, access to all of that information, so that then you can make an informed decision, and then you have to be free to accept or reject vaccines.
According to the CDC, there is no federal requirement for informed consent regarding immunizations. For state and local regulations, you need to check with your local or state health department. So this is a 10th Amendment issue, since the 10th Amendment states that all powers that are not specifically given to the federal government are the responsibility of the states.
Whatever was not defined in the Constitution as a matter for the federal government defaults to the states. Public health laws are state laws. Vaccine laws are state laws. Now the federal government has to protect the borders. So they can make laws about people coming into the country who have infectious diseases or who are not vaccinated, right? But in our country, it's the states. That's why you have different vaccine laws in different states. Different states have different exemptions. Right now, 50 states have medical vaccine exemptions. 47 states have religious belief vaccine exemptions, and 16 states have medical, religious belief, and a third exemption that's worded as either a conscientious belief, philosophical belief, or personal belief exemption.
Vaccine laws are statutory. In other words, they are created by a particular state, not the federal government. In my investigations, one topic that initially interested me the most was the amount of vaccine education that a typical medical doctor, especially a pediatrician, receives when he or she is in medical school. Here's what the experts had to say.
Vaccines were not very much discussed in medical school, other than this is what vaccines do. They save lives, they protect people from disease, and this is the schedule you need to use in your pediatric clinics to give to kids. Started medical school in 1983, and it wasn't until 1998 that a mother came over to me and said, "Dr. Larry, did you know that there's mercury in vaccines?" And I said, "No." And instead of just pushing it aside and saying, it's just such a small amount, it doesn't matter, I actually started looking to see what else is in vaccines. And I realized that there's a great amount of material in vaccines that impairs many cell structures and cell functions.
I really didn't think about vaccines very much throughout my career, because I don't know if you know this, but medical doctors really aren't taught anything about what's in vaccines or the contents or the problems that can happen after vaccination. We're basically given a sheet of paper during a pediatric rotation and told this is the schedule and to keep up with it. And so the thinking there is, oh, I just got to make sure that everybody's got the ones that they need and which ones they need, and not really critically thinking about it at all. I used to think it was just me because I was an adult internist, but when you look at people like Dr. Larry Pilevsky and Dr. Tony Bark, who actually specialized in pediatrics, and you hear the same thing from them, then you realize that Medical schools are not providing this information, and there's no incentive to go and look. There's not a lot of time during residency, so unless something's really a problem, you're not going to go, trying to disprove a well-proven theory or practice. Nobody does it.
I've got a daughter in medical school and a really good friend in medical school, and I've asked them, because they're already being taught vaccines are safe and effective, and they're the best thing you can do to further the health of the population. They're already being taught this. And I was never taught when I was in medical school 30 years ago what was in a vaccine. We were only taught that they're wonderful and do them. So no, most doctors trained today have no idea what's in the vaccines.
When I went to medical school, I graduated in 1985, and at that period of time, when I went out into practice, there were only 3 vaccines really that were used in children. There was DPT, MMR, and polio. And it wasn't until 1991 when there was the big ramp up of the vaccine schedule, starting with the hepatitis B vaccine at birth, and then they added the Hib, and then chickenpox and Prevnar, and now we have 46 doses of 16 vaccines that are given to children by the time they're 5 years of age. So I would say that when I was in medical school, there wasn't much to talk about. There was only the 3 vaccines. But then we had this big ramp up, so anybody who's graduated from medical school and gone through a residency program from 1991 forward, which has been 25 years, the only thing that they're told is here's the schedule and here's how you give it, and you really need to deal with those parents who are doing this whole thing called vaccine hesitancy now.
Dr. Tenpenny just mentioned a term that you may have heard before, vaccine hesitancy. We'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to address the apparent lack of vaccine education that most doctors receive while in medical school. Perhaps things have changed since Dr. Palevsky and Dr. Tenpenny and Dr. Humphreys attended medical school. I wanted to get an idea of the current courses that a typical medical school student would take while they're at a school like, say, Harvard. The first year includes the following 13 total courses.
Introduction to the profession, the molecular and cellular basis of medicine, the human body, human genetics, patient doctor 1, introduction to social medicine and global health, clinical epidemiology and population health, introduction to healthcare policy, scholarship in medicine, physician and community, integrated human physiology, immunology, microbiology and pathology, and medical ethics and professionalism.
It appears that whatever is taught about vaccines and vaccination in Harvard's 5-year curriculum is done with one course: immunology, microbiology, and pathology. If you search through the curriculum of dozens of other medical schools in the United States, you'll find that there is not much variation from Harvard. Apparently, vaccines and vaccination are simply not featured prominently. Now let's go back to what Dr. Tenpenny mentioned earlier. Apparently, vaccines and vaccination are simply not featured prominently. Now let's go back to what Dr. Tenpenny mentioned earlier. She mentioned the term vaccine hesitancy. Now, what exactly is this? According to the World Health Organization, vaccine hesitancy refers to the delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccination services. Let's listen to Dr. Tenpenny once more to get the full context of her statement.
The only thing that they're told is here's the schedule and here's how you give it, and you really need to deal with those parents who are doing this whole thing called vaccine hesitancy now, which is being published in all of the medical literature saying that all of these crazy people, why wouldn't they want vaccines? They're actually even combing information off of Facebook of the arguments that people get into and try to come up with arguments to convince more and more people why they should be vaccinated.
In an attempt to have a safer vaccine approach, I did something in 2008 when I started integrative pediatrics that is pretty much unheard of for a pediatrician to do, and that is to one by one give parents the real facts about the vaccine, the benefits of the vaccine, the risks, and the alternatives. So informed consent. And I truly believe this is what doctors should do. We need to get back to doing that if we're doing something to a healthy person. You know, you got a healthy child in front of you and you're saying, well, we're gonna do this thing to you, this vaccine, and it's a good idea. And all they're being told is it's safe and effective, do it. And oh, by the way, if you don't do it, you're gonna have to leave my practice. That's what's happening today. That should be illegal. I mean, if you have a doctor that's telling you to leave your practice if you don't do what I say, That's called paternalism, and we were taught in medical school that is the worst way to practice medicine. And yet the Academy of Pediatrics is now saying that's okay. Today, pediatricians are being trained on how to, I would just use the word coerce, their patients into doing all the vaccines.
Why do pediatricians need to convince and coerce parents to vaccinate? Shouldn't parents be presented with the facts and then be able to make up their own mind? Did you know that the AAP, the American Association of Pediatricians, actually has an entire website page dedicated to teaching physicians how to persuade vaccine-hesitant parents? Some parents just want to spread out vaccines. But in the video entitled, "Are There Too Many Vaccines?", in order to convince the mother, who's really an actor, that there's no need to spread out vaccines and that really doesn't give you any additional benefit, the doctor, who's also an actor, refers to a study of over 1,000 children where, quote, researchers found no evidence that getting all the vaccines on time during infancy is associated with any developmental delays.
The study to which she was referring was published in the journal Pediatrics in June of 2010.
Sure enough, here's the conclusion, and I quote, "Timely vaccination during infancy has no adverse effect on neuropsychological outcomes 7 to 10 years later. These data may reassure parents who are concerned that children receive too many vaccines too soon." That's the actual conclusion. Now, the children studied were born between 1993 and 1997. So let's take a look at the actual vaccine schedule back then. In 1995, prior to 18 months, a typical baby would receive the 3 doses of the Hep B, DPT, Hib, and polio vaccines, as well as the MMR, a total of 13 doses. However, according to the CDC schedule in 2016, by the age of 18 months, a typical child would receive 3 doses of Hep B, 3 doses of rotavirus, 4 doses of DTaP, 4 doses of Hib, 4 doses of pneumococcal, 3 doses of polio vaccine, influenza, and the MMR, varicella, and 2 doses of Hep A, for a total of 26 doses. That's exactly double the doses that were studied in the original study. How can the AAP take a study that concluded that 13 doses had no effect on neuropsychological development, and then apply that same study to 26 doses and come to the same conclusion without any further studies? Let me ask you a question. Is it possible that some vaccines work and some vaccines don't? Is it possible that some vaccines cause severe side effects and some don't?
We have to look at vaccines on a vaccine by vaccine basis. So saying that you have concerns about the hepatitis B vaccine, about the infant series of the hepatitis B vaccine, which is not based on science, doesn't mean that you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and you want to do no vaccines ever for any children. That's not what this is about. But what ends up happening is that a parent who says, like I did, a parent who says, I want more information, I don't think I need the hepatitis B vaccine, I'm hepatitis B negative, my husband is too, we've been in a monogamous relationship for 3 years, there's no chance that my child could get exposed to this disease, is then told, well, you're an anti-vaccine fanatic, how dare you question our science, which, you know, and then is vilified and ridiculed, and then that parent ends up turning away from all vaccines because they've been sort of ostracized by, you know, mainstream medicine.
Another problem that I see out when people talk about vaccines is that it's very convenient to paint all vaccines with the same brush, and we can't do that because the fact of the matter is there are different kinds of vaccines. Some of them have live viruses, some of them have killed viruses, some of them have killed bacteria, some have pieces of bacteria, pieces of virus, and so we have to distinguish, are we talking about a live virus? The influenza vaccine, we talked about pertussis, whooping cough, but we didn't talk about the vaccine, but that's another killed vaccine, a subunit vaccine, meaning it has particles of the, either some of the toxins or some of the pieces of the external bacteria. And so those vaccines don't stimulate immunity on their own. You have to add aluminum to them, whereas influenza vaccine, you don't have to add aluminum to the influenza vaccine, but most of the other killed vaccines, you do need to add aluminum. And when you do that, what happens is you're stimulating that more of an antibody response than a cell-mediated response. And so those are the people that are going to be more prone to allergies later, and who won't have, that's why you need, you know, when you're a newborn baby at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, you know, in 1 year, and then again when you're 4 years old, and now we're told that every time a woman is pregnant she needs to get a pertussis vaccine. Well, that's why, because immunity is really short-lived after those particular vaccines.
Dr. Humphreys just articulated other issues that arise when vaccines are painted with a broad brush. Some vaccines need additives or adjuvants to create the immune response. And there are different types of immune responses. In other words, antibody versus cell-mediated. The polio and the injected flu vaccines and the DTaP are composed of inactivated kill viruses, while the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, is composed of a live virus. It's important to remember that there are various types of vaccines, and all of them are different, with different ingredients, different risks, different side effects, different benefits. But let's get back to our focus on the current CDC vaccine schedule, which is one of the things that almost every doctor is taught while in medical school. When I was a baby in 1968, I think I got about 3 or 4 vaccines in total, and I was considered to be fully vaccinated. But in order to be fully vaccinated today, it's much different.
What we have now is 69 doses of 16 vaccines that the federal government is saying everybody should, all the children should use from day of birth to age 18. Back when my children were receiving vaccines in the late 70s and 80s, it was 23 doses of 7 vaccines. So we've had a tripling of the numbers of doses of vaccines that children are now getting. And in that time period, as this dramatic escalation of the child vaccination schedule has occurred, what have we seen? Have we seen children be healthier? Just the opposite. We have an epidemic of chronic disease and disability. 1 child in 6 in America now learning disabled. 1 in 9 with asthma. 1 in 50 with autism. 1 in 400 developing diabetes. Millions more with inflammatory bowel disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, epilepsy. Epilepsy is on the rise. We have children who, 30% now of young adults have been diagnosed as having a mental illness, anxiety disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia. This is the worst public health report card in the history of this country. And it has coincided perfectly with the tripling of the numbers of vaccines.
If a pediatrician does not abide by the standards of vaccination and promulgate them, then they themselves become legally liable for being sued. So even if they're open and they're like, oh, well, she doesn't want to vaccinate according to the schedule, and then someone actually gets injured or gets an infection, then they themselves could be legally liable, whereas they are completely expunged of all liability if they follow without any thought the vaccine schedule.
When I was a kid, I got smallpox vaccine and I got polio vaccine, and that was it. My kids received 69 doses of 16 vaccines.
A typical 2-month-old baby will be getting as many as 9 vaccines at once. I mean, it may not be 9 injections, but it's 9 vaccines. I mean, can be at once. They can be getting a hepatitis B, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, Haemophilus influenza B, pneumococcal, rotavirus, and I might be missing one.
I'm pro-vaccine. I had all 6 of my kids vaccinated. I think vaccines have saved millions of lives, and I just accepted the dogma that they were safe and that's what the science said. I started looking at the science, and I started calling people within the agencies. I called Paul Offit, who was a big defender of vaccines, and I called Kathleen Stratton at CDC and other people within the agencies, and I started questioning them. And their answers, they gave me the answers that they gave to the public, but I was informed about the science. And when I started drilling down with them on the science, it was clear that not only that the science they were citing me was bogus, but that they knew that it was weak, and they were unwilling to defend it in front of informed criticism. And that shocked me, because these were not, I was used to environmental agencies becoming captured, but a public health agency that is charged with protecting the health of our children, to lie about science and to manipulate science, which is what they were doing, just seemed criminal.
There was a study published in Pediatrics that showed that parents who decided to delay or forego some vaccines were parents who made over $70,000 a year and had the most education. So why is it that the best educated parents who have the highest socioeconomic income are choosing to delay some vaccines? It's not because something is wrong with those parents, it's because something is wrong with the current CDC vaccine schedule. I'll tell you an industry kept secret, which is that a lot of doctors in America are choosing not to vaccinate their children on the current CDC schedule. Almost every doctor I've interviewed has chosen an alternative schedule for their children that is based on better health and better science. It's a really well-kept secret that the people working at the CDC are also alternating the vaccine schedule for their own children. And how do I know that? I know that because I've talked to them. So I had someone who's an active, very, very vocal spokesperson for the current vaccine schedule who confided in me that that person did not do the hepatitis B vaccine because when that person looked at all of the data, that person realized that it wasn't a good idea. So here we have public health officials screaming from the rooftops that parents must do this vaccine schedule exactly as it is put out by the CDC, while themselves in their own families are choosing not to follow it. Whenever I have a doctor who I talk to who says I alternate the schedule, I say, would you share that? Can I use your name? And they say, I don't want to lose my job. Or I don't want people to know, or I'm choosing not to do these vaccines because I know they're not effective or I know they're not necessary, but you can't let anybody know. And I'm a journalist and I'm bound to journalistic ethics and I could never reveal who those people are, but I can tell you that I have spoken to them myself and they have told me the truth. And the truth is that they are alternating the schedule in their own families for their own children.
Why would CDC employees not follow their own vaccine schedule? Why would pediatricians not follow their own vaccine recommendations to their own patients? In medical schools across the globe, physicians are taught that the current CDC schedule has been proven to be safe and effective.
In 2013, the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, issued a report that said that the current federally recommended child vaccine schedule of 49 doses of 14 vaccines given between day of birth and age 6 has not been adequately studied for safety. And one of the issues was that the vaccines may have been studied separately, but they have not been studied in the combined schedule, including giving 8 to 10 vaccines on one day. So that is something the Institute of Medicine has acknowledged. The federal government disagrees, but I think everybody needs to understand that child vaccine schedule has not been adequately studied for safety. Fewer than 40 studies have actually studied the schedule. That's not enough studies to prove that that schedule is safe or effective.
Plus there haven't been any studies looking at the synergistic effects of the ingredients. So if you have one metal, what does it do to the body? If you have one metal and another metal, what does that do to the body? If you have one metal and antibiotics, what does that do to the body? And it's already been shown that metal detoxification in the presence of antibiotics is diminished versus metal detoxification without antibiotics. You have metal, antibiotic, and then you have microorganism. What is the synergistic effect of that? So none of those amplified studies or the look at the amplification of one ingredient's effect on another have ever been done.
The studies in this book, Miller's Review of Critical Vaccine Studies, this book, there's 400 studies in here. And these are studies, most of these studies are recent studies. These are all studies that are showing problems with vaccines because I got tired of hearing medical doctors saying there are no studies that show that vaccines are a problem, that vaccines are unsafe. What are you talking about? That is an outright lie. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies published in peer-reviewed journals documenting safety and efficacy problems associated with vaccines.
the consensus around vaccines is just like tobacco science. You know, would we have fought for tobacco science? There was a time when every doctor was saying smoking cigarettes is good for you, or at least it's not bad for you. I mean, that existed, and the industry was just paying for tons and tons of science to be done that supported that issue. That's what's happening in vaccines.
Back in the 50s, doctors were promoting this brand, right, Smoke Camel or whatever, and the doctors were telling you it's good, it'll relax you, it'll help you. The tobacco companies back then knew. They had their own data. They knew that tobacco was a carcinogen, that there were problems. And once we did the huge studies, followed millions of people over years, decades, I mean, everybody today knows, right? I mean, everybody knows tobacco is a leading killer. We need to do those same sorts of studies for vaccine.
We do need to do more studies on vaccines and more testing. While the CDC recommends polio, hepatitis B, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, rotavirus, Haemophilus influenza type B, and pneumococcal vaccines for 2, 4, and 6-month-old infants, this combination of 8 vaccines administered during a single physician visit was never tested for safety in clinical trials. In addition, the CDC report entitled Mixed Exposures Research Agenda states exactly the opposite and concluded that mixed exposures to chemicals, including pharmaceuticals and stress factors, may produce unexpected, deleterious health effects. In the executive summary, we read this, and this is a quote: "Exposures to mixed stressors can produce health consequences that are additive, synergistic, antagonistic, or can potentiate the response expected from individual component measures." Did you know that since the late 1980s, vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued?
The vaccine makers have been protected by Congress under the Vaccine Injury Act. The anger and the rage that whites in my audiences I've attended, blacks and Latino mothers, they said, wait a minute, we can't sue them? I mean, even those that I have met that are pro-vaccine, when you let them know that the vaccine makers cannot be sued, even they say, wait a minute, I'm against what you're here for, but I ain't for that. You telling me that I can't sue the vaccine makers if it's proven that vaccine injured my child? I said, no. That's right. They're indemnified. You can't touch them.
One of the first red flags that scares me the most about vaccines is that they remove any potential for litigation against any damage from vaccines. What that tells you is that they don't have the science set up properly. The original vaccinations, the toxins or whatever they wanted to call them, to try to put a tiny little bit of a disease into you so that that would get your immune system to become aware of that and used to that, and then therefore fight it off and be stronger. That principle is actually a fairly sound principle. But when it came to making money and getting everyone to get vaccinated for all manner of things when it wasn't required, it became a money scheme. As children, we were injected with all manner of poisons. I remember when I was a kid, I couldn't figure it out. One day my eye drooped. Remember my eye drooping? Directly related to a vaccination. My eye drooped permanently. Vaccinations are irresponsible the way that they're done. If they were responsible, if they made absolutely sure that there was no possibility of a negative side effect, and that if they didn't do their due diligence properly, that they could be litigated against, fair is fair. They don't do those things. There's so many red flags around vaccinations.
You have the vaccine manufacturers pretending that they were having production problems and going to Congress and saying, we need to upgrade our plant, our physical plant, to make more of this, but we're not going to spend the money because we're getting sued. And if we're going to get sued, if we're going to spend the money to make a product to get sued, it doesn't make sense for us business-wise. We're dropping out of the vaccine business. And all of the vaccine manufacturers went to Congress and told them, we're dropping out of the business unless you do something to make it so that we can stay in the business, which is where the Vaccine Compensation Program, the Vaccine Act, the Vaccine Court, the things that you've heard so many things about around this area over the past few days. That's where the whole idea came from. It came from the manufacturers who could no longer defend themselves, and Congress saying we need to protect the vaccine supply.
I think the choice at that time was was not an irrational choice by Congress given the alternatives. that they were presented. And the alternative was that I think the calculus was based upon the idea that at that point, there was so much litigation against the vaccine companies that the pharmaceutical industry was considering abandoning vaccines altogether. Okay. So Congress, and I think the vaccine companies went to Congress and said, we're going to stop making vaccines, and that's going to be a national security problem, because if there's a bioterrorism attack, or if there is an epidemic, there's going to be no factories that are up and running that can create new vaccines that can respond to those national emergencies. And so if you want us to continue to make vaccines, you're going to have to give us immunity from litigation. And that's what happened.
If you're a surgeon, you can't go into the OR without liability insurance. What business do you know is allowed to practice and offer its service without liability insurance?
And what product that carries a risk of injury or death, what other product is mandated to be used by every single person born in this country multiple times? And there's no liability for anybody.
The vaccine industry has absolute legal immunity. In other words, they push all the risks of their toxic interventions onto the individuals, the families, the moms and dads. They take no risk whatsoever. And you know why? Because they have legal immunity, and it means they have no reason to have quality control. They could put, if they wanted to, they could put radioactive cesium-137 into a vaccine and inject people with it and cause you cancer, and they would have absolute no liability whatsoever. They could put anything in a vaccine, and to some extent they do. They put known neurotoxins in the vaccines. It's criminal. It's criminal what they do to our fellow human beings.
The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act that our organization worked on to try to get safety provisions in that law says that your doctor is supposed to keep a permanent record of every vaccine and lot number given. Your doctor is supposed to write down in a child's permanent medical record if there is a health problem that occurs that's serious, hospitalization, an injury, and report it to the Federal Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System.
With no responsibility and legal immunity, basically, the companies that manufacture vaccines have no reason to have quality control. They literally can put whatever they want into vaccines. Barbara Loe Fisher's nonprofit organization, the National Vaccine Information Center, worked with Congress to pass the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. This law included a centralized vaccine reaction reporting system, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS, VAERS, which is jointly operated by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Let's have a listen to a few experts discussing the topic of adverse reactions to vaccines.
In the United States, we have the VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. And this is the system that doctors or patients, anybody, can report a possible vaccine reaction to. The reason it doesn't work is this, Ty. I'm a pediatrician. I should be seeing all these vaccine reactions, right? And you ask any pediatrician, how many vaccine reactions have you seen? I haven't seen any. I mean, a little bit of redness where the shot's given and some fever, we expect that. But no, I haven't seen any reactions. How can that be? Well, either there are no reactions, or we don't know what to look for. I think it's the latter. So here's the thing. Kids will have seizures after vaccines, and we'll say, oh, well, that's normal, because you can have febrile seizures, and that's a normal thing. We're taught that febrile seizures are normal. And are they? I don't know. Let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. Let's follow them and see, do the unvaccinated have febrile seizures as well? SIDS. I'm trained to think that that's just normal. We don't know what causes it, but it's normal. Well, let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated and see if they both have the same amount of SIDS. Neurological problems, autism. which, remember, is the tip of the iceberg. What about all the ADD, the ADHD, the autism spectrum, the anxiety and the depression that we're seeing? And we're not even talking about all the autoimmune stuff we're starting to see at higher levels, diabetes type 1, and we're seeing way more allergies and eczema, and you're hearing more and more about people with peanut allergies that have to carry EpiPens around. Would that still be in that unvaccinated arm? Would they have all those same, levels of these disorders, these chronic diseases that we're seeing in kids? I'd love to see this study be done. That's what we need to do.
I think there's a government-industry collaboration to promote vaccination. We know that government sees itself primarily as the promoters of the vaccine program, and they're supposed to also warn us about the risk. And by the way, they're supposed to, under the law, the legislation, the Vaccine Act, publicize the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. We know from a recent report from the Government Accountability Office that the people who are pushing the vaccines did not want to publicize it because they thought that conflicted. That's not me saying that, that's Congress. Congress commissioned a report, they said that, so they intentionally did not publicize the vaccine program. By the way, it's my statutory obligation as a lawyer who does this to promote the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So we can consider this interview as promoting the statutory purpose of the Vaccine Act. And everyone in our country, especially the doctors who don't know how to recognize vaccine injury, should know that there's a vaccine injury compensation program, should be familiar with the types of injuries that occur, and be receptive to it, and report it to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System so that we can monitor what's going on. That's not happening.
What we see on VAERS is not 1/10 of the injury, which is what the government says. The government says it's probably 1/10, right? It's probably 1/1000th. And I say that because I didn't know to report to VAERS. I ran a pediatric emergency room. I trained in pediatrics.
And you didn't know you're supposed to report vaccine injuries?
No. And we had in our ER, when I was a student, when I was a medical student, a resident, and running the ER, we certainly saw kids, and I would moonlight at other hospitals even, that came in who had stopped breathing or had seizures after they'd been in the vaccine clinic. Nobody reported that. Nobody went and said this has to be reported.
Didn't even know?
No. It was kind of like we knew that happened, okay, but they didn't get reported. So think how many don't get reported.
Doctors are not taught what a vaccine adverse reaction looks like. In fact, when a parent calls the doctor and says, my child was vaccinated, I can't wake him up, he'll only wake up to feed, he's sleeping for 2 days, the parent is told that's normal. And when the parent raises the question, could this have been from the vaccine? Meanwhile, the kid had never done that before. The doctor almost unanimously says, no, it's just a coincidence. That kid suffered brain damage. Sleeping for 2 days as an infant, not waking up other than to feed, that kid was brain damaged. Had brain inflammation. Not waking up for 2 days other than to feed is a neurological event. That's not normal. And that's from the injection of material into the brain.
1989 is the year that this epidemic of childhood illnesses began. Autism, ASD, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, something called misery disorder, which I've never heard of before. Tics is Tourette's syndrome and a family of grave neurological injuries that became epidemic that year. SIDS, narcolepsy, seizure disorders, things that, and of course food allergies and asthma. And all of those things began in 1989. On all of those illnesses, there's science today, there's science out there that indicates that those illnesses are being caused by thimerosal or adjuvants like aluminum or squalene or some other vaccine association.
Something is happening to the brains of our children. Something is interfering with the normal neurosequencing of brain development. Because when babies are born, their brain is not developed. When babies are born, they have more nerve cells than their brains need. And it's through life experience that the tracks are laid down to create the proper sequencing of muscular development, speech development, cognitive development, and emotional development. Something is interfering with the proper sequence of those steps. Something is getting in the way of the brain developing properly. No one is asking the question, why? Why are so many kids having an interference of the proper sequencing of brain development? Why, as of January 2016, are we seeing 1 out of every 20 children under the age of 5 with a seizure disorder?
Yeah, I believe that it's clear that the vaccines were the beginning of my downward spiral in my health, which became sort of a lifelong issue as far as bronchial asthma, as well as other health issues that emerged. So, so it was a very personal journey for me and advocacy, because I wanted to see, is the literature supporting the view that there are this many adverse effects that could occur? And it turned out, after spending 10 years looking at the research, I've got all of it on my website, there's actually over 200 adverse health effects that have been documented caused by vaccines in the schedule today.
VAERS. That's the acronym for Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. The name itself implies that vaccines are not totally safe because of the fact that there are admitted adverse reactions. After the legislation was passed that exempted vaccine manufacturers from liability, there was still a small loophole in the law that allowed for manufacturers to be sued. But even that small loophole was closed in 2011 with a Supreme Court decision.
You could still sue a manufacturer if you could show the manufacturer could have made a safer vaccine. In 2011, a case went to the Supreme Court, Brucewitz versus Wyeth. It was a DPT vaccine injury case. And the lawyers representing the pharmaceutical industry, government, and medical trade convinced the Supreme Court that there should be no liability at all for the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to vaccines that are licensed by the FDA as safe and effective. The Supreme Court majority, with 2 dissents, Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg dissented. The Supreme Court said vaccines are unavoidably unsafe, and there shall be no more lawsuits against any vaccine company.
So legally, they're classified as unavoidably unsafe. That's their legal classification. And when I say that in court in these state, cases that I have, which are not injury, obviously that's federal court. Right. The judges always stop me and go, "What? What did you say? Wait, repeat that. Yeah. Repeat that." And I'm like, "They're legally classified as unavoidably unsafe, Your Honor." And then they're like, "Whoa, wait a minute."
So today, if you or your child are injured by a vaccine or your child dies from a vaccine, you cannot hold anyone accountable in a civil court of law. Anyone who makes and sells the vaccine, who regulates the vaccine and who makes policy for the vaccine, who votes to mandate for the vaccine, or who gives the vaccine. The only one who's left with any responsibility of what happens to a child after that child's injured by a vaccine is the parent.
My son sustained a permanent brain damage. So there's a big inner struggle because you see that your child struggles with basic things that most children can easily do. That is, learn language, learn how to speak, learn how to tell colors, comprehend more complex issues. So yeah, you do have guilt, but at the same time, if you didn't know in advance that was a possibility, and you blindly simply accepted something innocently that was told to you would be the best thing you could do for your child, you can't beat yourself up forever.
Over the course of my travels, I was able to interview many parents, including several attorneys, who could personally testify that the 2011 Supreme Court decision that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe was no joke, and that what happened to their child was proof. Listen to Congressman Bill Posey from Florida describe how he believes that every member of Congress should co-sponsor studies to make sure that the vaccines we give our children are safe.
But I think every member of Congress should be a co-sponsor. There's no why does anybody fear requesting a study? I mean, why does anybody fear it? And you go back through this stuff. And some of my friends here who are doctors, you know, I talk about the issue with them, you know, and they say, oh, you're nuts, you know, there's been dozens and dozens of studies. And I was like, how many of them have you read? What you know is a big blue-eyed pharmaceutical rep comes in here with your Super Bowl tickets and tells you about these dozens of studies that say this, that are not true.
So when I started putting it all together and realized, wow, Ryan was severely vaccine injured, I thought, I have to get the word out. I can't let this happen to other children. And I was one of many, and we thought people are going to want to hear this. First thing I did, I wrote to the pediatrician who we no longer went to, but the pediatrician who vaccinated him. Wrote her a 5-page letter about all that had transpired, including not being able to get through to her when our son nearly was killed by his vaccines. And then I called to follow up to make sure she'd received the letter. And I said, you know, what makes you so confident that these vaccines that you're giving day in and day out are safe, that they're not harming kids? And she said, and I quote, she had a 1-sentence answer for me. This was pretty much the end of our phone call. She said, because the pharmaceutical reps tell me they're safe. So, you know, the very people who are profiting from these products are the ones claiming their safety. They're also the ones who are allowed to do their own studies and tell the FDA, another safe vaccine, we want you to approve it. Right around age 2, I figured it out on my own with no help from my pediatrician. I woke up one morning, it was a Sunday morning, I'll never forget it, and a neon light in my mind, the word autism, and I just truly believe that was divine intervention. That was the day. I had just had my 3rd child 3.5 weeks prior to that, and I think God wanted me to get through that pregnancy before the bombshell and hit that there was something really wrong with our 2-year-old. And so he was subsequently diagnosed with autism, which is a term I hate to use because it is what the medical authorities and government entities and pharmaceutical companies have coined to divert the blame from themselves. It's really encephalopathy that he has. He has brain damage, catastrophic brain damage from his vaccines. He also has immune system damage. He has been tested. He makes antibodies to his myelin basic protein that covers every nerve sheath in your body. So you can imagine if your body's attacking that sheath on every nerve cell, your nervous system is not going to work. He has GI issues. He has heavy metal toxicity. He has been greatly harmed by routine childhood vaccinations, and I refuse to call them immunizations. Vaccination most certainly does not equal immunization in any sense of the word. So he's now 22, a boy in a man's body, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 180 pounds. On a good day, he has the cognitive abilities of a 5-year-old. He must be cared for 24/7, 365 while I'm here interviewing with you. A former tutor of his is taking care of him for 2 days. It's not normal to have to hire a babysitter to care for a 22-year-old man, but unfortunately it's becoming the norm in our country. He still works with tutors 40 hours a week. We do a special behavioral program that helps them to learn new things and maintain that which we've already taught. And he's not able to work. He could not imagine a 4 or 5-year-old holding down a job. It's not going to happen. He's never gone on a date, and he never will. He's not going to get married. He's not going to have children. He's been robbed of leading the life that he would have lived had we not vaccinated him. And it's, as a mother, it's painful. If I could have one do-over, one do-over in life, no vaccines for any of my children.
Are you enjoying episode 1 thus far? Have you learned some great information? Are you excited to see the rest of this show and the next 6 episodes? Do you think others would enjoy watching it as well? Do you want to support our mission to educate the world on the truth about vaccines? Then help us spread the word by clicking the links below and sharing on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media sites. Your support makes a huge difference in how many people we reach and ultimately how many lives are saved. Thanks in advance, and please click the links below to help us spread the word. Now let's...
I discovered later that for the decade of the 80s, I was prosecuting the wrong drug dealers. But by the time I learned that, which was in 2002-03, Shortly after that, we discovered that the drug dealers we should be prosecuting had immunity from liability. Well, what I mean is that I discovered, and this is largely a product of personal experience, that one of the greatest threats to the health of our children is, among other things, vaccines. And I say that without saying that all children get hurt by vaccines. Vaccines, it's arguable, play a very important role in promoting health. But I have seen, based on my personal experience, how vaccines can be damaging. And when I had that personal experience, and I fully recognize that the authorities do not agree with me, and we've tested that, and unsuccessfully. But we discovered, when I started pursuing that and trying to promote the interests of my own child, other parents started asking me about how they would bring a vaccine injury case because their kid was injured. This was primarily at the time, this is 2002, 3, 4, focused on parents of children who have been diagnosed with autism. And I didn't even know until 2002 that there was something called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which was sort of an experiment in tort reform that changed the entire civil compensation system, taking it out of the courts and putting it into a special program. And when I discovered it, other parents couldn't find lawyers, so they started asking me would I handle their cases. And the rest changed my entire law practice and also essentially my entire life, because now I focus at least 80% of my time on vaccine injury cases, and there are more than I can handle. I'm not suggesting that everyone on the government side or in the court, certainly not in the court, are bad actors, that they're doing this out of some ill will or some desire to hide something that they know about. The system is set up in a way that we cannot get at the truth. And that is a much more profound policy problem that's cultural, that's societal, that's political.
We start from the position of what we're for, not against. We are not against anything, we're for our kids. And if you could show us that anything is going to benefit our children, we're all in. And we showed that by believing whatever the medical community, and I'm not against the medical community, said to do about vaccines, and we did it. And so as a DA, as a prosecutor, I deal with circumstantial evidence, and I look at motives, right? And so all we did that really started a storm in our community and really internationally was share our testimony and give our opinion. Share our testimony and give our opinion. Our testimony is our journey with our son about how he was developing normally. We have the pictures like so many other families. Hundreds of thousands of other families share our story. We have pictures, we have video, he's reaching all his milestones, then something happened. Something happened, there was some intervening cause that made our son not be normal and not develop the way he was. And so we have to ask ourselves, what was that? We didn't drop him, we didn't get in a car accident, he wasn't exposed to any chemicals other than vaccines, and that was the only intervening cause. And it was immediate, it wasn't like it was months developing, a year, not even a week, it was immediate. I mean, it was almost like we were driving down the road, got in a car accident, we walk away, but our son doesn't. It was that type of event. And so that you know, we shared that journey, and then in my opinion, in my wife's opinion, and it wasn't immediate, it wasn't like we just automatically thought it was vaccines. We believe that the vaccines caused is the tipping point, over the edge, the straw that broke the camel's back, whichever way you want to say it, that caused our son to be in the situation that he is now.
We have 4 children, so we kind of went the same route with the first 2, Maya and Michael, who were vaccinated, and Maya even had some reactions as well with the skin allergy and hives, breaking out in hives, and then our 2 youngest one, Leah and Zaiter, have never been vaccinated. They completely, I mean, the way they develop is completely different.
It's apples and oranges. I tell people that we became an unintentional study. We have 2 children that we followed the schedule, and again, we didn't know any better, we followed the schedule, and our first daughter, tremendous hives. After like 4 or 6 months, I don't remember which round, they thought it was an autoimmune disease. First-time parents were freaking out. We had some fool actually tell Davi that she was allergic to breast milk, which is insane. And you know, she loves breastfeeding our children, and poked her and prodded her. Nobody gave us an answer, so we just kind of went on. We just didn't know. We didn't know anything about it. And we didn't even think about vaccines. I mean, when it happened immediately after also, but God forbid anybody blames vaccines. And so, and then and to this day, Maya, and we're in the process of detoxing her too. We have to look at her, even though she hasn't been vaccinated since she was 3, and she's 8 now. She sleeps and scratches in her sleep. She does jujitsu, and when she sweats in her gi, she has these ringworms around her elbows and her joints, and so she has skin allergies. So we feel, and this is our opinion, and it's very frustrating for me. I'm a type A personality, you know, I trust the Lord, you know, and I defer to Him on everything I do, but in my flesh, I'm a very take control type of person. And when people try to tell me that your son was born this way, or there's no correlation, or you're stupid to have this opinion, or how can you go against science? I'm like, look, my oath as a prosecutor is to ensure that justice is done. What does that mean? It means that we get it right. I do that for a living every day. I look at circumstantial evidence, I look at direct evidence, I look at expert evidence, I deal with science and theories. So this is, I mean, all I'm doing is wearing my lawyer hat, either as a defense attorney or as a prosecutor, for our children and for this issue. And so, to me, it just makes complete sense that there's a correlation. And then people say, well, there's correlation but not causation. I hear that argument all the time, right? Well, in my world, correlation means investigation. But in this world, correlation means stop your investigation. That makes no sense to me. And the analogy I told someone the other day, if someone said, Mr. DA, there is a murder at 123 Street, and we have 5 suspects because there were only 5 people in the house. Okay, well, who caused the murder? We don't know. We have correlation between suspect number 1, but no causation between any of them. But don't consider suspect number 1 anymore. That's insane to me. They're all suspects still. Until you can show me what the cause is, they're all suspects. And nobody can tell us why our son is on the spectrum of autism, why he was developing normally, why all of a sudden that after that round of vaccines, that was it. And that's not a shot against doctors, that's not a shot against anything. It's a plug for truth. I mean, we obviously want to find out the truth, and we're amongst hundreds of thousands of other parents. In my common sense approach, I look at 1 in 15,000 children that were autistic in the 70s when I was born, early 70s. And today, as you and I speak, it's 1 in 43. And with a projection, as you know, in 16 years of being 1 in 2, and people are just going to sit around and be politically correct and not worry about it?
It's not about greedy lawyers, not about greedy trial lawyers. And it's not about parents who are looking for a free handout. The most common line that I have ever heard in all of the cases that I represented in front of that court, and I tried the first 2 cases in the vaccine program. I tried the first death case and the first live case. And from those cases on to the last case that I ever did, with the exception of 1 case, the first words out of the parent's mouth were thank God. Not thank you, not thank you to the judge, but thank God. And what they were saying was, thank God I have an answer. I didn't do this to my child. And when they come to me, the first session is, and I'm getting a little emotional myself, but the first session is heart-wrenching because they come to me and they say, I need to know that I didn't do this to my child. If I didn't vaccinate my kid would be just like all the other kids in the playground. What did I do wrong? And they get the answer from the court saying, the vaccine caused your child's injury. You didn't drop your kid. You didn't rock him on your leg too hard. You didn't squeeze him too hard when you were hugging him. It had nothing to do, you didn't put him in the crib the wrong way. Nothing to do with your parenting. It was an outside force that went into your child's body. That's the most important message that any of these mothers and fathers that you see in this hotel right now want to hear, is that they didn't do anything wrong.
That's so important to remember. If you're the parent of a vaccine-damaged child, you didn't do anything wrong. You were just trying to protect your child. We learned earlier that vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued if a person is damaged or even killed due to a vaccine. But I'm sure that you've heard of large settlements being paid to families of vaccine-injured children, right? Like the Hannah Poling case.
The authorities, especially in the courts, have refused to recognize the fact that vaccines can cause a syndrome or a constellation of symptoms that equal autism, despite the fact that there was a very celebrated case where that was in fact conceded by the government.
What was that case?
That was the Poling case, a very well-known case where initially the government conceded that vaccines, specifically MMR and other vaccines, or 5 vaccines one day, caused autism-like symptoms because of an underlying metabolic susceptibility. The government actually conceded that case. The concession was not public. Someone released it and it was leaked. And it became public and became well publicized in the winter and spring of 2008.
Hannah's father, John, is a Harvard-trained medical doctor and neurologist, and in 2008, he claimed that Hannah's autistic symptoms were caused by a vaccine reaction after she had received 5 vaccines, the DTaP, Hib, MMR, varicella, and polio, at the age of 18 months. Here's what's interesting. Hannah had been part of a study of normally developing children prior to being diagnosed with autism and had received an advanced brain imaging technology being developed by Harvard University. Her father, John, was able to present compelling evidence that the vaccine reaction was causative of Hannah's autism. The vaccine court ruled in favor of Poling, stated that there was sufficient evidence to conclude that vaccines given to Hannah Poling likely aggravated an underlying mitochondrial disease causing brain damage with features of autism. The Poling family was awarded $1,507,284. But you may be asking the question, if you can't sue vaccine manufacturers, then where did the $1.5 million come from? The money came from the Vaccine Injury Trust Fund, also known as the NVICP, National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which is basically a stash of cash collected on every vaccine sold and given to children and adults in the USA. That trust fund is financed by a 75-cent excise tax on each vaccine actively recommended by the CDC. On multivalent vaccines, in other words, those that contain more than one active disease, for example, trivalent vaccines like the MMR and the DPT, then 75 cents is paid on each valent, or a total of $2.25 for each trivalent vaccine. The Hannah Poling case is only one case, but there are literally thousands of cases where families have received a monetary award from the trust fund due to the court's ruling that the child was damaged by a vaccine. In the next segment, Congressman Posey from Florida discusses some congressional hearings on the safety of vaccines as well as the trust fund.
They had in the Senate a hearing on this, and I watched all the high-profile defenders of the public good get up there and throw the softball questions to the expert, which was a top Navy medical doctor. And, you know, they basically said, vaccines are absolutely 100% safe. There is no harm in any vaccine to any person. And anybody who says otherwise, you need more time. Anybody who says otherwise is a complete idiot, you know? And so I'm watching this on a monitor because I'm skipping. I got 2 hearings I'm supposed to be at right now. And so I'm screaming, ask them about the trust fund, ask them about the trust fund. You know, but nobody asked about the trust fund. I mean, if these things are 100% safe, why has the trust fund paid out over $3 billion to injured people?
There's clearly a potential for harm. No question, no one will deny that. So as a parent, typically it's a parent evaluating this for their child, you need to make the responsible decision to carefully evaluate the evidence and look at the risk, look at the side effects, and see if the benefits warrant or justify that, because you have to balance the scale for your child. Your child's too young. They can't do it for you. You have to do it for them. And if you do that and you carefully evaluate it, and you may reach a different conclusion than the public health authorities and your pediatrician is telling you.
The vaccine industry only tells part of the story. They like to highlight children who are sickened by pandemics, measles, mumps, and so on. And they claim that vaccines are completely safe and effective, implying zero risk. Well, this is a distorted science or junk science on their part. The truth is that vaccines have risks themselves. And if you look at vaccinating very large populations, you end up with more children having side effects from the vaccines than would have caught the disease that the vaccines claim to prevent. There's no such thing as a completely safe vaccine. Every medical intervention has risk. And that risk is completely ignored, even denied by the vaccine industry, because they don't want people to think rationally and scientifically about risk versus possible benefits. You know, it's interesting when you look at any kind of a medical intervention, whether it's drugs or chemotherapy or surgery, there's a risk versus benefit ratio. And an informed person makes a decision to go into that when the risk is low and the reward is high, right? That makes sense. But when it comes to vaccines, the risk is very, very high of damage and the reward is very, very low. And it's that equation that the vaccine industry does not want people to think about.
The question is, do the risks outweigh, the benefits and vice versa? And for some children, there is a great risk. And the real problem, the real issue is that we don't know which children those are. And because we don't know, we are exposing those most vulnerable, most at-risk children to these immunological agents.
Congressman Posey mentioned $3 billion being paid to vaccine-injured people. On the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website, I found the data report. Through January 1st, 2017, there was over $3.56 billion in total outlays to families of injured people. We need to evaluate the risks and the benefits of vaccines and then come to our own conclusions.
The idea that we can't question vaccines now is derived from the success of what people believed happened with smallpox and polio. So whenever I get involved in a debate about measles vaccine or MMR or thimerosal, people say, yeah, but what about smallpox? What about polio? I said, we're not talking about those. We're talking about something completely different. Can we stay on topic? Can we focus on this and actually deal with the safety issue? We're not talking about either the benefits of vaccination, which are very questionable. There's certainly many, many questions that need to be asked. We're talking about the safety. They're two very, very different things. Yes. People talk about the benefits when they really should be focusing upon the safety. Just because something may produce a beneficial effect, that does not make it safe.
I was in a group practice with 4 other pediatricians, and around 2004-05, I saw my first case in my own practice, so a child that I'm taking care of who was completely normal at age 1 regressed into severe autism over a matter of months. So by age 2, this child was nonverbal, no eye contact, suffering. Some of these kids suffer. They have pain. They have a severe abdominal pain and GI stuff, sort of the stuff that Wakefield was charged to look at back in the day. And I'm thinking, I'm reading there's no link, we don't know what's causing it, but so I'm thinking it's a coincidence. It has clearly nothing to do with vaccines.
Because that's what you were told.
Oh, that's what I'm reading almost daily, right? We have what we call throwaway journals for pediatricians. So there's an infectious disease journal. If you look at all the ads in it, it clearly comes from, it's supported by pharma. But it's very well written. It looks good. It's glossy, and it comes across your desk weekly. And you read, pretty much almost every copy of that will have something that's elevating vaccines and putting down, any possible connection, right? Putting down Wakefield as a, fraud, and they would just repeat that. So you read that over and over again. I'm sort of reminded of weapons of mass destruction, and off we went to war. You hear it enough times, you start thinking it must be so. But anyway, next year, I get another case. My practice, a kid in my practice who was doing great, perfectly normal at 1, becomes severely autistic. And I was seeing at that time about 100 babies a year. So maybe slightly more. 100 to 150 babies a year would join my practice at that time. So that's an autism rate of 1 in 100, 1 in 150, which is about what it's been reported to be back then. I should remind you or tell you that when I was in medical school in 1985, I saw not one case of autism. So I'm at a regional center, Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and there I didn't see a single case. In my residency training in California, again at major centers, I had one case that I recall of what we called PDD-NOS, Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. And that's sort of another code for autism spectrum. That's the term we used back then. One case in all those years. So it is true that the autism rate has just skyrocketed. Absolutely skyrocketed. You'll hear people say, well, we're just better at diagnosing it, right? Oh, come on. These cases that I'm telling you about, so to get back to them, you can't miss them. They weren't missed, they didn't exist. You cannot miss a kid who's got no eye contact and is flapping perhaps and not talking when they were talking before. This was something new. This was something different. Fast forward a couple more years, I had 4 cases. So in November of 2007, I walked into a room and there was a little fellow, I know his name, I mean, he's still my patient. And he'd been normal at 1 when I'd seen him. He'd seen my nurse practitioner at 18 months and was doing great. And he was like we're behind the window. He had his back to the window in a stroller and he was just doing this. And I went up to him and I said, you know, called him by name and tried to get his attention. I can usually get kids to interact. Nothing, he was gone. And he ended up being my 4th case in 4 years of normal 1-year-olds who were completely severely autistic by age 2. And it was the last straw for me. It was like, I'd already been doing my own research about toxins and I knew all about the thimerosal and that how huge the dose we were giving of thimerosal of mercury was so far exceeding the safe limits that, you know, it was criminal. And I'd also been starting to become aware of the amount of aluminum that we were injecting.
You are going to institute a public health measure across the board for all healthy children in the country or in the world, then you've got to make absolutely certain that it is as safe as it possibly can be. And any red flags should be interpreted beyond doubt that there is a problem with that vaccine until proven otherwise.
Any red flag with vaccines should be considered a problem, and we should apply the brakes until it's proven safe, not vice versa. And remember, the entire purpose of this documentary is to facilitate discussion about vaccines and to overcome the idea that we cannot even ask questions about them. A sentence in the DHHS Register, Volume 49, number 107 from June 1st, 1984, was in reference to the final rules for polio vaccination campaigns in the United States after 3 decades of controversy. And I quote, "Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives." Why are well-founded doubts not allowed to be discussed? We're here to explore uncomfortable topics in order to protect our children and humanity. Dr. Wakefield just mentioned smallpox and polio. Dr. Wakefield just mentioned smallpox and polio, so I want to address the history of both of these vaccines. We'll cover smallpox in this episode, and then we'll get to polio in the next episode. Edward Jenner was born in 1749 in Berkeley, Gloucester. He was orphaned at age 5 and he went to live with his older brother. During his early years, Edwin developed a strong interest in science and in nature that continued throughout his life.
If we go back to the dawn of this idea, Jenner, Dr. Jenner was observing, as a number of people had, that the milkmaids that were milking the cows that had the cowpox didn't suffer from smallpox.
And this is a couple hundred years ago.
Oh, this was way back, yeah. So some of them posited that I wonder, you know, if there's a reason that they're getting or encountering this cowpox, that it might have something to do with preventing the smallpox. So they started taking the pustules and the material, the debris from the cows with cowpox, and they would open up the arms of victims, I call them, and stuff that biological material, unknown material, into these arms of these people, these kids. And there was a high-level sepsis, blood disease, there was amputations because of it, there was death, and there was smallpox as well. But the idea of vaccination, vaca meaning cow, comes from that concept. Now, they had no idea of immunology at the time. It was an observation, and I'm not against observing things, but then to violate the way the natural order of the universe is and work and violate the skin and puncture it and put all these unknown materials in there, it's a disaster. It's horrible. And that's where this all started.
Smallpox was a big problem. You know, people were dying, you know, it would accumulate in the throat, these pox, and people would suffocate and they couldn't swallow. It was painful, there was scarring, was horrible. But like any disease, you have to look at what the conditions of the environment was like, which tells you how well people's immune systems are able to work. And that's really the key. And then on top of that, it's how the disease was treated. So people have been trying to fight smallpox for a long time. For thousands of years they had been trying to come up with, in ancient Hindu times they were trying to take scabs of smallpox victims and use those for vaccines. And each time what happened was that just epidemics were started when this happened. So using smallpox. Yes, because using smallpox as a vaccine, they didn't know how to attenuate, which means to make the vaccine weaker, the virus weaker. And so they were basically just giving a controlled case of smallpox. And it didn't go well because, of course, it spread to any contacts, and there was an incubation period where people wouldn't know they were infected. So that plan failed several times in different parts of the world.
What was interesting, of course, about smallpox is that you were deceiving the immune system by giving vaccinia or cowpox, which was structurally similar to smallpox, which seemed to, at least theoretically, produce an immune response against the smallpox virus. And Jenner noted, as other people did, is that girls who got cowpox from milking cows were protected against smallpox. And all that led to him then practicing on his son, experimenting on his son and his next door neighbor, and giving them multiple doses of this very, very crude extract of cowpox. And ultimately, I believe, leading to catastrophic failure in their immune systems and death of both children later as young adults. So not an experiment that you would necessarily consider well designed or a good outcome.
Dr. Wakefield said that Jenner actually inoculated his own son and neighbor with smallpox. The neighbor boy's name was James Phipps, and he was only 8 years old when he was initially inoculated. Over the next 12 years, Jenner's son and James Phipps both were inoculated over a dozen times. Phipps died at the age of 20, and Jenner's own son died at the age of 21, both from tuberculosis. Since then, the smallpox vaccine has been linked to tuberculosis. Vaccinations became mandatory in England in 1853, and by 1857, fines and imprisonment awaited people who refused to be vaccinated against smallpox. Dr. Humphreys just mentioned that once smallpox vaccinations became mandatory in England, massive epidemics began to occur. According to official figures of the Register General of England, between 1857 and 1859, there were over 14,000 deaths from smallpox. Then, between 1863 and 1865, there were over 20,000 smallpox deaths. A few years later, there were almost 45,000 smallpox deaths between 1870 and 1872. But England wasn't the only place to make smallpox vaccinations mandatory. It happened in the United States too. In 1855, Massachusetts enacted forced smallpox vaccination laws. Similar to what happened in England, following the 1855 mandate, there were smallpox epidemics in 1859, 1860, 1864, 65, and 67, culminating with the infamous epidemic in 1872 and 1873. Similar events occurred in Germany, Japan, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Italy, Holland, Austria, and Japan during the late 1800s. As vaccination rates increased, so did the incidence and deaths from smallpox. I won't go into all the graphs and numbers, but they're readily available.
The doctors of the time were, saying that this is absurd, that we're still seeing plenty of smallpox in people who have been cowpox vaccinated, and that this vaccine is far from safe, that people were having major issues from it. Deaths were happening. In some cases, in the years that the vaccine was being used, the hospitalization rates and death rates for smallpox were higher than the years before the vaccine was even invented. Then there was, this episode in a city called Leicester in England at the time where they had a 95% infant vaccination rate and had some of the worst epidemics in history in that city. And so people were outraged because mandatory vaccination had been instituted, people were being arrested and their belongings confiscated. Horrible. We went through a lot of these stories in the book. And so people had had enough, and so they demonstrated. And so there was this great demonstration, which is one of our chapters. And there was a big rally with over 80,000 people that showed up. I mean, these people were angry. Their kids were getting really messed up from this vaccine, and it wasn't working. So it's one thing to take the risk of getting a vaccine if it's working, but in this case, it was lose-lose for them. So they decided they were going to stop vaccinating. And instead, whenever somebody had smallpox, they had people that were already immune tend to the person, and they sanitized everything in their midst and kept them isolated. And that turned out to be actually the best way to deal with smallpox in communities. And so, you know, predictions of doom and gloom that there was going to be a wildfire of smallpox set upon the planet as a result of this, lunatics who wanted to stop vaccinating were, you know, dictated from on high. And of course that didn't happen. And we give you the exact numbers in Dissolving Illusions of how the death rates plummeted and how the outbreaks actually went down significantly. And Leicester, compared to the surrounding towns that continued to vaccinate heavily, had the lowest death rates. And in lots of cases, the actual outbreak rates as well.
The eradication of smallpox was actually really a function of containment and isolation, of quarantine, rather than the vaccine itself.
Dr. Humphreys mentioned a city called Leicester in England. It's very interesting what happened in the city, which saw a massive outbreak of smallpox in 1871, despite an almost 100% vaccination rate. Quarantine and isolation, according to Dr. Wakefield, led to the eradication of smallpox. And Dr. Humphreys just mentioned a rally in Leicester, England in 1885 where 80,000 people got together and protested mandatory vaccines. They actually won their freedom of choice. Over the next 8 years, the vaccination rate there went from approximately 95% down to only 5%. And during this period, if someone had smallpox, everyone in the infected area was placed in strict quarantine and the house was thoroughly disinfected. She documents the way that the death rates decreased drastically after they implemented quarantine and isolation. These facts are illustrated in depth with studies, graphs, and charts in Dr. Humphreys' book, Dissolving Illusions. Consistent with this theme, according to the World Health Statistics Annual, 1973 to 1976, Volume 2, and I quote, "There has been a steady decline of infectious diseases in most developing countries, regardless of the percentage of immunizations administered in these countries." Now that's certainly an interesting quote, and we'll discuss the decline of several infectious diseases in a later episode. We're going to look at the graphs and we're going to see what's true and what's false. I want to focus on one word in that quote, the word immunization. Beginning with smallpox, the process was referred to as variolation, or inoculation, and it was the beginning of what we now call vaccination. In today's vernacular, oftentimes the terms vaccination and immunization are used interchangeably. But are they the same thing?
I want to be very clear up front. As a scientist who owns my own private science lab, I am not opposed to the theory of immunization, the theory of it, how the body could respond to things and build its own immune system. What I am vehemently opposed to is the quack science behind the pushing of toxic vaccines that contain toxic elements and toxic chemicals that harm and kill children all across the world.
So, you're not against the theory of vaccines, but you are against the way that they're pushed today.
No,
and
I said I'm not against the theory of immunization.
Immunization. Explain the difference.
Vaccination is not immunization. So your body has a natural process of immunization in response. It's an adaptive response to exposure to, for example, live viruses that are all around us. You immunize yourself when you are exposed to a virus. Your body recognizes it because you have this functioning immune system, the blueprints of which are built into every cell of your body. You're a biochemical master of immunization. Yeah. You would not be alive if your ancestors weren't really, really good at this. So we immunize ourselves naturally all the time through exposure to viruses that make some people sick. Well, who do they make sick? The people who are vaccinated. Why is that? Because the vaccines harm the immune system. They compromise the immune system. They weaken the immune system. In the same way that you send an astronaut into space and they have no gravity, they have no stress on their bones and stress on their muscles. What happens? They atrophy. They lose bone density. They lose muscle mass. They come back to the planet and they can hardly walk. Why is that? They become weak. Vaccines do that to your immune system. They make your immune system weak and make you vulnerable to other infections. A healthy immune system, practicing healthy immunization, is in people like you and I. I haven't been vaccinated since I was a kid, and I haven't been sick in over a decade. Why is that? Am I somehow, have I been able to avoid all viruses? No. I'm shaking people's hands, I'm in public spaces, people cough on my food just like they cough on your food. Why am I not sick? Because my body is exhibiting its own immunization without vaccination.
Immunization has nothing to do with vaccines themselves. So people have to start using these two words correctly. If they really conferred immunity, they wouldn't have to keep giving these booster shots. Real immunity is for life.
Our bodies were designed to create it, to develop an immune response, and when they're healthy, they create it. So when you're exposed to an infectious agent, it's going to form the protective antibodies. Not only for a short term like you do with vaccines, but it's going to do it virtually indefinitely, and in most cases lifelong. You have lifelong permanent immunity when you have a healthy immune system and you're exposed to an infectious agent. That's the ideal. You know, now they're doing these vaccines and it's like, well, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 5 years. You know, there are third, fourth boosters of DPT now. It's going to be 10 boosters. You're going to have to get it every year. It's just insane because it's not the way the body was designed to create an immune response. When you do it artificially, it's almost universally going to be less than ideal.
The way you naturally develop an immune response is through breathing a virus in the air or breathing it into your nose, never being injected directly into your bloodstream.
It does make sense that if vaccines conferred real immunity, which is for a lifetime, then there would be no need for booster shots. And as Dr. Group just mentioned, we're never naturally exposed to a virus by injection, but rather by breathing. To be clear, the terms vaccination and immunization refer to two different things. The purpose of The Truth About Vaccines is to facilitate discussion and debate on this controversial topic of vaccines. And in order to spur discussion, it's important to ask questions. That's all we're trying to do here, because in the current climate, you cannot question vaccines in any way, shape, or form.
It's like a Platonian philosophical technique. It's just it's a presupposition.
Yeah.
If you presuppose it's true, you don't even question it. I mean, there is no question. It's just, this is what you do. And you start to give babies starting 6 months old the flu shot, and you start to do this and you start to do that. It's like, it's not even questionable anymore.
Right.
And that's where it becomes dangerous, because the people who do question, they're considered the outliers. They're considered the dangerous ones. And now look what's happening around the country.
I know how medical establishment is operating, and that doctors have to follow certain protocols. And if they were to understand that if they follow these protocols and they harm people, it would be very hard for them as humans to do that. So the establishment is making everything possible to prevent doctors from realizing that what they're doing might be harmful. Therefore, you have these studies that seemingly deny what is obvious to the eye.
My articles could not be published because we rejected this. The editor doesn't even send the article out for review. The editors is not specialist. The peer reviewers are the specialists. Basically, when customarily, when you send an article and manuscript to a journal, the editors look at the journal, look at your manuscript, the editor look at the manuscript, and then refer to the experts. That's called peer reviewers. The peer reviewers are the experts, but they stop at the editorial level. They don't send the manuscript out for peer review. That is the problem. And even in one article, the first article I tried to publish the HPV DNA in the vaccine, the editors sent out for peer review, and all 3 peer reviewers say this manuscript could be or should be reported, should be published. And then after the agreement for publication, the editor find a reason to reject it. That's editorial censorship. Then I have to submit it to another journal. And fortunately, I find another editor who's more sympathetic.
And you found a journal to finally publish it.
That's one of the problems in revealing the truth. The ugly truth may not be welcome.
If the debate is frowned upon and not allowed, then you have to ask the question, why isn't it okay to talk about these issues? What is at stake here? Why wouldn't we want to have the safest, the healthiest, and the most scientifically based vaccine schedule that we possibly could?
Why is this taboo? Why can't we do rigorous scientific studies with one group that's vaccinated and one group that's not? We should have at least 30 studies like that on every vaccine, but we have 0 on every vaccine. we don't have any studies like that. And I started to become aware that something is wrong. Somebody's trying to hide something, right? As soon as it's like, oh, you can't talk about that, it's like, well, why not? Why can't we talk about that?
Science is not taking place here. Fraud is taking place. And we've got to get back to science. We've got to get back to demanding science take place. When, you know, what I find fascinating when I question, you know, doctors and pediatricians that are involved in this, and you're within a minute and a half, you realize that their entire understanding of vaccines is just because they told me so, just because they said it was safe. It's safe because they told me it was. Well, do you understand how a vaccine works? Well, I know how to give a vaccine. No, but do you know how it works? Do you understand that it's not going through safety testing? Do you realize it's not categorized, a vaccine is not categorized like a pharmaceutical drug, that it doesn't have to go through the same safety tests as being rushed down the market? Well, no, but I mean, it's safe. And they just keep repeating this line. You're like, oh my God. Well, you know, these poor doctors really, in a way, have spent a fortune on an education that has robbed them of actual information. And so you realize this fraud and this mantra of vaccines are safe. Don't talk. Vaccines are safe. They're safe. They're safe. They're efficacious. I mean, it's just not true.
It's like saying the sky is blue, and some people come up and say, no, it's not blue. It's it's green. It's pink. I don't care how you spin it. The truth is the truth. Right. It's blue. Okay, you can describe it as azure. You can say it's sky blue. What? It's still blue. You can't say it's green. You can't. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, that's a controversial subject, Dr. Buttar." There's no controversy about the truth. You can doubt the truth and say, "Oh, it's not the truth," or "It's controversial," but it still remains the truth. Just by labeling it something else doesn't change the truth.
So when the whole measles outbreak occurred in January of 2015, and I say outbreak very loosely, it turned out to be about 150 people infected with the measles virus, and just about all of them recovered fully. One person, unfortunately, did die from the measles. That person was highly immunocompromised, very sick, and only on autopsy was it shown to have measles. But what happened with me was when a friend of mine called, she's a PR representative, and she wanted me to go on NBC, the local affiliate in Phoenix, to talk about the measles outbreak. So I went on NBC, did my piece on there, and that led to a lot of commentary on the Arizona Republic website. And that commentary was large part negative. People were very upset. They were immediately calling for my censorship, for my license.
If you offend the powers that be, if you offend public health, if you offend the pharmaceutical industry and threaten their bottom line, as we did by calling into question the safety of MMR, there is no price that you will not pay. That's it. It isn't, people talk about conspiracy theory. This is just ruthless pragmatism. We will destroy you in order to protect our bottom line. And that's the way these people operate.
There have been ramifications for me professionally for making the decisions that I've made, because choosing to not vaccinate on the schedule. I used to be affiliated with Children's Hospital Boston, which is a very conventional institution. And they have a program where pediatricians out in the community can bring medical students into their office and sort of mentor them for a couple of days. It's really only a couple of days a year. But of course I would be talking to my patients about my philosophy and the way I do things in front of these medical students. So after a while, word got back to the powers that be over at Children's Hospital Boston that I wasn't vaccinating on the schedule. So the first thing they did was to tell me that they didn't want me participating in that program anymore of mentoring medical students, because, hey, they didn't say it in this way, but it's like, we don't want our medical students hearing an alternative philosophy or hearing a different point of view. So mind you, it's not that I was forcing anybody to not vaccinate on the schedule. Parents were coming to me with their children because they wanted to not vaccinate on the schedule. I was offering an alternative. There's certainly 1,001 pediatricians out there who would, vaccinate them, by the guidelines. So I stopped having these medical students in my office. So the next thing that happened was the next time every year or maybe every 2 years, you have to re-credential with the hospital so that you can be on their roster, so that your patients can go in there if they're sick, and so that you can be affiliated with insurance companies and the patient visits can be covered. So they told me they weren't going to allow me to stay on their list of affiliated doctors because of this issue, which would mean that I couldn't be affiliated with Blue Cross Blue Shield or some of the insurance networks. So it was really a form of marginalizing me, blacklisting me for this choice that I had made. So there's ramifications for doctors who are making these kind of choices.
Dr. Wakefield, Dr. Wolfson, and Dr. Levitin are just 3 of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors that have suffered professional ramifications for attempting to facilitate discussion about vaccines and for giving their patients the freedom of choice not to follow the CDC vaccine schedule. When debate and scientific questions are not allowed to be asked, when ad hominem attacks are rampant, and when name-calling is pervasive, the subject of vaccines almost becomes more of a religious type of a debate as opposed to a rational scientific debate.
It's gathered an extraordinary momentum, taking on the life of a religion rather than any kind of science or primary public health measure.
It's a sacrament in the Church of Pharmaceutical Mysticism. It is not a real scientific endeavor anymore. It's about the holy grail attempt, if you will, to achieve artificial antibody stimulation. Or they might claim that the antibodies are real, but they're not the same thing, and they don't provide the same level of immunity should you acquire and encounter the disease in the natural state. And that's a big problem, but they'd like us to believe that it isn't.
It is such a religious belief that when you present a physician or somebody who believes it and doesn't know why they believe it with contrary information, they immediately get very defensive and angry and incensed and furious. And I understand that because it means that everything they have been taught to believe is topsy-turvy and really messed up. And if that's true, then they've been lied to. I mean, they're not consciously thinking all of this, but I mean, I've analyzed why it's so, but that everything they've been taught, they've been lied to, they've been, if that's not true, then what else isn't true? And if you're a doctor, then, I've had doctors tell me, I don't want to know anymore because I'll have to change the way I practice, and I just can't do that. Like, it's overwhelming. And some doctors who are really smart can't hear it. They can't hear it, and I'm like, okay, they're yelling at me, like, you're a quack, and you're dangerous, and you're killing patients.
It's not all just money. It's also, there's the dogma that if anybody says anything bad about vaccines, you're going to fuel this, this mythical anti-vaccine movement, and children are going to start dropping dead. So your actions could end up killing babies.
This is the most grounded, firmly entrenched belief in preventive medicine and health and conventional medicine, that this vaccine are crucial to be healthy. And in my belief, nothing could be further from the truth.
How is it that the opinion that all vaccines are safe and all vaccines are effective has become so firmly entrenched in our society that it's not even up for debate?
This network president told me that if one of his talk shows allowed me on the air, that he would fire the host. This person is a friend of mine. And I would have to fire the host because this is where our advertisers are. And if he lost an advertiser, it's a major catastrophe for the network. One of the problems is that all of the institutions in our democracy that are designed to protect little children from a predatory corporation have in essence been neutralized or removed. You've had the Vaccine Act got rid of all the lawyers and all the judges and the class action suits and multi-district litigation suits and depositions and all of the things that curb bad corporate behavior in every other sector, including the pharmaceutical sector. They've gotten rid of the CDC by capturing that agency. So that's the agency that's supposed to be the frontline agency that protects little children from a predatory corporation, and they have been thoroughly captured by the industry they're supposed to regulate. The press has effectively been neutralized. All you have to do, Ty, is sit down and watch the 6 o'clock news on TV and see how many of those stories are bracketed by pharmaceutical ads. I was told by a network executive that during non-election years, during some months during non-election years, up to 70% of his news division revenues are coming from pharma.
I started looking at the playbook.
Okay.
So the playbook for vaccines is the same playbook that they're using for GMOs. So if the industry hires shills, not only, so in the vaccine world, it's not just the industry. We have the CDC looking for mommy bloggers, looking to pay people to blog as though they're just lay people, but there's federal dollars going to pay these people.
And they basically
and it's to promote
do what?
promote
vaccines.
vaccines.
The system to promote vaccines, so if you make vaccines, you want them given. And if you can have it become a standing order, that is a guaranteed sale. So the push has become vaccinate, and the push has become let's get the message out there, vaccines are safe and effective, and let's squash any idea that there's a problem with vaccines. And if our media would be honest, they would look into things like this. And this is the problem we have with our media. I really feel like they pick and choose how they're going to report on things. If there's something that's along the lines of vaccines are safe and effective, you hear about it immediately. I read studies all the time that should be headlines, and nothing.
It effectively locks out any kind of debate that you have, not just in the major networks, but also in the so-called alternative media, you know, which is supposed to be the antidote to the corporate control of our country. Places like Salon and Slate and Huffington Post and Daily Beast and Mother Jones, also those media outlets will not cover this debate. I think it was Malcolm X said that the greatest power of the press is the power to ignore, and you know, that's what we see in this sphere.
The power to ignore those who question vaccines and not cover the debate is an enormous power. But just because the press has the power to ignore, we refuse to ignore the topic of vaccines. Please remember, when we discuss pediatricians and doctors in general, we're talking about lots of good people, noble people, in a noble profession.
I'm convinced that 99.9% of every young adult going into medical school have a heart to serve, have a heart to help. I do believe there are some people out there in it for the money, but by far, most kids are in school trying to do what's good, and then they get indoctrinated. And you look at the research, and then you look at the textbooks, and everything is formulated in a very biased way to convince people to one direction. So you graduate after really being brainwashed for 8 years. And then you just, well, here's what we got to do. It's a public health service. And I actually studied at one of the premier public health schools in the world, and I'm telling you, you want to talk about social pressure? That's a public health banner. That's what their focus is on. It's hard to buck the system because you don't even know you're bucking the system at first. I think it's really important to remember too, these individuals aren't the enemy. To me, the enemy is, you know, yes, the system, the big pharmas, the old white-haired men that are just like in the background making billions. I mean, there are people, you can look at this, but at the end of the day, the doctor, the physician, they're just trying to help.
Part of it is why it brings me to tears when I think about it, is because, you know, it's just, I mean, rationally you can objectify. I didn't know any better. I mean, there's no question, but it still caused harm. I really did not know, and I failed miserably on my responsibility of doing my due diligence on, you know, selecting a therapy that I believed would have more benefit, and in reality, I just did not do my homework.
Most doctors are good people who are just trying to help, but they're hamstrung by a broken system which discourages questioning medical dogma, and as we saw earlier, even encourages physicians to coerce patients into accepting medical procedures to which they do not consent.
Science is accessible to anyone who wants to learn it. And that's the beauty of what I do and what we have in this world, which is still relatively free, is that any of us can pursue science and use it to expose the toxins that are in medicines. And that science is irrefutable because it's reproducible, in any lab anywhere else in the world.
I mean, we have to start talking to each other. The public health officials have to talk to the parents have to talk to the doctors. We all have to sit down and talk about these issues. This is not religion, this is science. We don't have to agree, but we can look at the evidence and figure it out together. We can't say, when you say it's off limits and you can't talk about it, that's when you should start having as many conversations as possible.
Once I saw this, it was impossible for me to walk away from it. It was like seeing a mugging on a street, or, you know, like being, just seeing some horrible atrocity. You know, like watching the, having been down at the train station in 1939 in Warsaw or Berlin and seeing, people shipped off to the camps, and you have to make a decision about whether to put your head down and pretend you didn't see it and protect your career, or whether you're going to speak up about it. And, I felt like I didn't have a choice.
I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of The Truth About Vaccines. We have 6 more episodes coming your way. Tell your friends and family, and tune back in for the next episode. Thank you, and God bless. Do you want to support our mission to educate the world on the truth about vaccines? Then help us spread the word by clicking the links below and sharing on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media sites. Your support makes a huge difference in how many people we reach and ultimately how many lives are saved. Thanks in advance, and please click the links below to help us spread the word. Welcome back to The Truth About Vaccines, episode number 2. Are you familiar with the ingredients in the CDC's recommended vaccine schedule today? Did the polio vaccine eradicate polio? These questions and many more will be answered in tonight's episode.
I hope you enjoy it.
The goal of The Truth About Vaccines is to present this information in as clear, precise, accurate, yet unbiased method as is humanly possible, focusing on the science, creating awareness, evaluating studies to determine whether or not vaccines are safe and effective. We also will be addressing the fundamental topic of freedom of choice. So let's get rolling with tonight's episode. Many of the studies indicating that vaccines are safe are epidemiological studies. Here's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. explaining the concept of epidemiology.
Epidemiology is the study of populations and the impact, for example, of an environmental condition or toxin on an entire population. So what epidemiologists try to do is they look at the population that was exposed to the toxin and they examine the health outcomes, and then they look at an unexposed population, which are called the controls. Epidemiology is notoriously susceptible to manipulation. You could design an epidemiology study that proved that sex does not make you pregnant. How would you do that? You would eliminate all the pregnant people before you did the study. So that you just ended up studying people who were having a lot of sex, but nobody was getting pregnant. Ergo, sex doesn't make you pregnant. So, and that's what they did with these epidemiology studies that CDC orchestrated. They eliminated the populations that had autism before they did the study.
I used to work for Merck. I sold Vioxx for them, 2001 to 2003, along with other drugs. And I really saw from the inside how shady and unethical things are done, and how data is kind of twisted around, the manipulation, the training that you really get, to how you can go in and influence doctors to say things that aren't even true, and convince them of it by building relationships and by making sure that you're their only source of information. So I worked for Merck and I saw how things went down on the inside, and I left because it was just ethically I couldn't stand it. But before I started working in pharma, I was just like everyone else. You know, I thought pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines were for the greater good. And then I saw it from the inside how wrong that really is, and how they twist all of the information.
There's a saying in my racket, which is environmental litigation, which is that statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. And statisticians, with an epidemiology study in their hands, have a perfect opportunity to manipulate data.
Statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. I asked Barbara Loe Fisher, the head of the National Vaccine Information Center, to elaborate on clinical trials and vaccine testing.
These clinical trials are very small, relatively small. And they don't really, they're also cleansed in that the participants in vaccine trials often do not reflect the population that gets the vaccine after it's licensed. They whitewash it. How? Well, children who are sick at the time of vaccination don't get vaccinated. Lots of kids get vaccinated when they're sick in this country. Children who have severe allergies, who have brain and immune system disorders, they aren't in those trials, but a lot of kids like that get vaccines. All of them do. In these clinical trials, they'll often use an active placebo instead of an inactive placebo.
That was really one of the real surprising elements to me when I started to research, because conventionally, I mean, I worked in a lab, I know what a placebo should be. It should be an inert substance that has no physiological effect. When it comes to vaccines, it's very rare to find the studies that are actually used for the FDA approval to use a saline placebo. Instead, what will be used is either the background substance of a vaccine, which might have aluminum in it, or polysorbate 80, or some amino acids, or even more commonly, another vaccine that has already been proven safe, So for instance, if you want to test this year's flu shot, you will test it against last year's flu shot for its safety rather than testing it against a saline placebo.
What safe really means is that it shouldn't harm you at all, that it shouldn't be any problem. But in safety studies when it comes to vaccines, one thing for sure is they don't use a true placebo as the control. So when you're looking at a new drug, say for high blood pressure, you're given a high blood pressure medication and you're giving something like a sugar pill. Well, with vaccines, they bring a new vaccine to market. They use either another vaccine with a known safety profile, or they use a shot of a substance that they consider to be inert.
This is one of the things that I wish I could make every parent in the U.S. understand, is that vaccines are not studied against placebo. So they are studied against the toxic additives that are in the vaccines, and then they give a shot in their safety testing. So the vaccine goes up against the toxic additives in a shot. So the aluminum, the formaldehyde, the polysorbate 80, so that in the safety testing, both categories have the same level of damage, right? So then, therefore, vaccines are safe. If vaccines were safety tested against a saline-based placebo, like they should be, like is the gold standard for pharmaceutical drugs, they would not be on the market today because they do so much damage.
When it comes to the Gardasil, the HPV vaccines, there were a very small amount of the original trials where they actually used saline, but the vast majority used either an aluminum-containing background substance or the rest of the chemicals that are in the vaccine.
The Gardasil studies used aluminum placebos. This is well documented. In the October 19, 2010 edition of the Annals of Internal Medicine, there was a study published by researchers at the University of California. They reviewed 167 placebo-controlled trials published in peer-reviewed medical journals in 2008 and 2009. They found that 91.8% of the drug trials and 73.3% of injections, vaccines never described the ingredients used in their placebos. So if we don't know what's in a placebo, then how can we know if the study is valid? In other words, if you give a sugar placebo to a control group in a diabetes study, then it might skew the outcome, right? In this next section, we'll hear from several experts about the vaccine creation process and also some common vaccine ingredients. Talk about the way that vaccines are cultured, the substrates. I mean,
sure.
Just go into the details about that because many people are unaware.
Yeah, well, they'll use chicken embryos, monkey kidney tissue, renal tissue from dogs, animals like this, aborted fetal tissue. They, of course, have to neutralize these things with toxic chemicals like formaldehyde, which is embalming fluid. Sometimes some other forms of antibiotics are utilized in the production, heavy metals to create an adjuvant kind of thing to aggravate the immune system so that they can use smaller amounts of the antigen that would produce what they're calling their holy grail, their antibody response. But it's an absolute nightmare because they haven't analyzed how it impacts other body systems in its entirety, much less multiple shots, multiple vaccines, all of the things that are in concert or the entire schedule.
You wouldn't allow the ingredients that are in those vials of vaccines to be put in your baby's bottle and let them consume them that way. You would have a conniption. You know, you're seeking out glass bottles.
If you allowed it, you'd be thrown in jail.
You'd be thrown in jail. If I babysat your child and I put all those ingredients or just empty the vaccine vials into your baby's bottle and fed them that, you would probably beat me up, but you'd for sure have me thrown in jail. Yeah. And I would go to jail for doing such a thing. Your baby, ironically, would actually have a small chance of clearing quite a bit of that out through their digestive tract. But these same parents who would never allow their children to ingest those vaccine ingredients are allowing someone in whom they have put their blind trust, someone in a white coat, to inject those same ingredients, inject into their baby. Multiple shots at one time. We're up to some office appointments now involve 8 syringes with 13 to 14 vaccines. Just that a doctor would do that. There's no medicine that a doctor would hopefully give 14 medicines at once, and your baby would never in the real world contract 14 diseases at once.
In 2005, the FDA put out a report about the contaminants of foreign DNA in vaccines. And they said in their presentation, we do not know if any of the contaminants that we know exist in vaccines from foreign DNA will lead to the development of any event. And they left it as an event. because they didn't know what event that would lead to. Whether a takeover of the DNA in the body, cancer, cell death, inflammation. They had no idea. But in 2005, admitting that there are foreign DNA particles in vaccines that are unavoidably in there, they said, we don't know if any of these foreign DNA particles can lead to an event.
What's Titron X100? Dow Chemical. It's a Dow Chemical surfactant in your household cleaner, in your industrial cleaner, in your paint. It's in your pesticides, Ty. It's a surfactant. And that's in your flu shot. And here's the thing. I don't care this whole concept of parts per billion. It doesn't make sense to me. If it's a toxic chemical, it's a toxic chemical. These chemicals, we know. Formaldehyde was in that flu shot ingredient list that my buddy shared with me. We know formaldehyde, according to the National Institute of Health, can cause cancer.
If you look at package inserts for pharmaceutical products, they're usually, they're folded up nice and small on very thin paper, and they're usually about this big, tiny print, both sides, and hidden somewhere in that maze of tiny print that you can't quite read would be the actual ingredients in the product, whether it's a vaccine or a medication you're taking. And somewhere in there is this long list of potential side effects, right? And as a physician, if you were, every time you wrote a prescription, if you were to stop and go through all of that, well, you might as well close your doors. There is not enough time in the day to do that level of informed consent.
Let's take two people. One person, person A, let's say, strong immune system, can respond to an infection, can respond to the presence of a virus and build their own antibodies, right? Person A. Now let's say there's person Z, immunosuppressed, living on junk food, vitamin D deficient, gets sick every winter, thinks they need a vaccine, all right? Now, person A, remember, strong response. Do they need a vaccine against the flu? The answer is no, because if they're exposed to the flu, they're going to immunize themselves, right? So, because they have a strong response. Person Z, if they get the vaccine, does it work? The answer is no, because they can't have a response to it. The vaccine fails on the person who could theoretically benefit from it, and the vaccine is not needed on the person who doesn't need it because they have their own immune building system. So what do the vaccine companies do? They add chemicals to the vaccine thinking about person Z. They say this vaccine doesn't have a strong enough response. So we're going to add these toxic inflammatory chemicals, these adjuvants as they're called. Toxic, should never be injected, right, into anybody. They add those to cause an inflammatory response, to try to get that person's body to respond to that vaccine injection. And that is where a lot of the hazard comes from. That's where you get epilepsy, you get seizures, you get people put into comas, you get autism. It's because of the toxic chemicals.
Nobody questions whether vaccines contain toxic chemicals or not. The real debate is whether or not the toxic chemicals are contained in large enough quantities to actually injure the person.
But certainly there is injury. The Supreme Court has stated that there's injury. There's been a lot of money that's been awarded in lawsuits, $3.6 billion. And there are codes in the actual, as a medical doctor, we use diagnosis codes called International Classification of Disease, or it's actually International Statistical Classification of Disease. And we just transitioned from something called ICD-9 to ICD-10. But in ICD-9 codes, there's 18 different codes that specifically define vaccine injury. If someone wanted to Google them and look them up, they would type in ICD-9 and look at 978 and 979. And each of those are ICD-9 codes. Have subclassifications 9 each, discussing the different injuries that are created by vaccines. So clearly, if there was no injury from vaccines, there would be no need to have an ICD-9 code. I mean, why would you create it? Why would you put that in your coding system if there were no vaccine injuries? The classification system defines it, and says here they are. Here's the 18 different injuries that we're going to list that you can give the patient as a diagnosis when they come in to see you.
Dr. Sawhney mentioned ICD-9 codes, specifically 978 and 979, each of which have 9 vaccines that they cover, totaling 18 vaccines that have diagnostic codes. You can see them on the screen right now. Many vaccines contain formaldehyde and Triton X100, both of which are known to cause cancer. Now, formaldehyde can be broken down when we eat it, but it can remain in its whole form when injected. According to the American Cancer Society, the types of cancer common among children, such as leukemia, are the types most closely associated with formaldehyde. The CDC's position is that formaldehyde is contained in such small doses in vaccines that it doesn't threaten human health. However, there's a conspicuous lack of research into the effects of formaldehyde exposure through multiple vaccines in pediatric populations. Given that infants and small children possess a much greater sensitivity to toxins compared to adults, and that formaldehyde is introduced to children through vaccinations containing a host of other toxic ingredients, shouldn't the CDC do some research and reevaluate its use in vaccines? Monosodium glutamate, also known as MSG, has been used as a food additive for over a century, but now it's also an ingredient in some vaccines. Dr. Russell Blaylock notes that MSG is classified as an excitotoxin, or a compound which overstimulates cell receptors to such an extent that the cell ceases to function normally, resulting in damage to nerve cells and contributing to seizures.
Vaccines are grown in a substrate. Some people, a substrate would be a petri dish. It's basically a medium that the vaccine can be grown in. So there's viral vaccines, there's bacterial vaccines, and the vaccines can be grown in human as well as animal tissue, basically animal and human living tissue. Some examples are chicken fibroblasts and embryos, chicken retinal and kidney cells, monkey and dog kidney cells, human embryonic tissue, lung tissue specifically, the fibroblasts found in aborted human fetal tissue, as well as monkey brain tissue. And there's others, but these are some of the more common substrates that live vaccines are grown in living cells. The problem is that now we're finding that these substrates also contain other harmful additives like glyphosate. So glyphosate, which is Roundup, which is a pesticide, herbicide pesticide made by Monsanto, is making its way into the vaccines as well. So, you know, we spray glyphosate ubiquitously, you know, almost on so many food products that they're actually finding their way into the vaccine. So when you're getting injected with a vaccine, you know, we're typically worried about things like thimerosal, mercury, phenols, you know, other chemicals, things, glycols, ethylene glycols, basically antifreeze, but also glyphosate. So in 2015, the World Health Organization actually declared glyphosate to be a probable carcinogen, okay? So it's probably a carcinogen, and it's being injected into your body when you get a vaccine. So in effect, you know, injecting a vaccine into someone's body that is contaminated with a probable carcinogen, glyphosate, probably deserves some congressional investigation in terms of its safety.
My son Bryce and I recently took a trip to Washington, D.C., and we sat in meetings with senators and members of the House of Representatives that are attempting to sponsor legislation to look into vaccine safety. Dr. Sani mentioned glyphosate specifically. Here's MIT scientist Stephanie Seneff discussing this important issue.
The glyphosate is a sleeper because its toxicity is insidious and accumulative. And so it slowly erodes your health over time. But it works synergistically with the vaccines. This is what I'm finding, and this is what I believe. And particular because glyphosate opens up the barriers. It opens up the gut barrier and it opens up the brain barrier. The brain has usually a very secure barrier that keeps toxins out, but the glyphosate messes that up. And as a consequence, those things that are in the vaccines get into the brain, whereas they wouldn't if you didn't have all the glyphosate exposure from the food. So the children who have sort of the leaky gut and they have the sensitivities to foods, they have gluten intolerance, you know, those kids are the ones that are especially vulnerable to damage from the vaccines because those are all indicators of glyphosate poisoning, and they're also indicators of leaky gut, and leaky gut is an indicator of leaky brain. So the poor child is getting these vaccines and this stuff is going into the brain and is causing neurological damage.
Something is happening to the brains of our children that is exciting, igniting, inflaming, irritating, agitating, and interfering with the proper sequencing of how the nerve cells sequence, develop, and proceed towards normal brain development. Speech delay is not a given. Learning disability is not a given. Low tone, weak muscles, lack of coordination, not sitting still, not focusing, not paying attention, these are not things that are a given. They are only happening because something is irritating, inflaming, agitating the brain and interfering with the way in which the brain is supposed to properly, sequentially develop.
There's a consensus in the scientific community that something is happening to the brains of our children. A surfactant is a compound that reduces the surface tension and increases the solubility between two liquids that would normally be unable to dissolve together, like oil and water. In vaccines, polysorbate 80 acts as an emulsifier to disperse all the other ingredients evenly within a liquid. Let's listen to medical doctors Tony Bark and Larry Pilevsky.
We use polysorbate, or which the other name is Tween 80, to open the blood-brain barrier when giving chemotherapy for brain cancer, right? We know it opens tight junctions, desmosomes, or the blood-brain barrier, or the gut barrier. They're all the same, but the scientific or medical name for these things are tight junctions or desmosomes.
So what we have is a lot of people who are espousing what other people tell them. But if I presented my medical research around vaccines to my colleagues in medicine, they would be ashamed of themselves, because they would never know that the aluminum in vaccines is not the same aluminum that you ingest or inhale. That the aluminum in vaccines is in such a structure that it can easily pass into the brain and bring with it viruses and bacteria. That the emulsifiers in vaccines, called polysorbate 80, are used by the pharmaceutical industry to get drugs to pass into the brain across the blood-brain barrier. But they're also in vaccines. And they also attach really strongly to aluminum. So as an adjuvant, aluminum has a kind of structure that binds tightly to the bacteria and the viruses. And then the polysorbate 80, the emulsifier, binds really tightly to the aluminum and to the bacteria and viruses, and can walk into the brain the way a ghost can go through a wall. The pharmaceutical industry uses particles like aluminum that are in vaccines to attach to drugs, to get them to go across the blood-brain barrier, because drugs don't go across the blood-brain barrier otherwise. And then the pharmaceutical industry uses an emulsifier, like polysorbate 80, to attach to the nanoparticle, that aluminum-type particle that is bound to the drug, to increase the entry of that drug into the brain 20-fold. That same technology that the pharmaceutical industry uses to enhance delivery of drugs across the blood-brain barrier into the brain is the same technology in vaccines. So, knowing that science, the question has to be asked: do vaccine materials enter the brain? No studies. Are vaccine materials supposed to get into the brain? No. If vaccine materials get into the brain, what happens? 1 in 6 children with neurodevelopmental disabilities, 1 in 50 with autism, 1 in 10 with ADHD, 1 in 20 below the age of 5 with seizures. Until proven otherwise. In 2011, there was a study published that surveyed over 91,000 children that showed that 54% of those children had at least one of 20 chronic illness. Now, here we are in 2016. I started medical school in 1983. These were not the data we were seeing.